is Andrea, founder of A to Z Communications, and this is the Brand Stories podcast. This is where we discuss all things related to branding. My guest today is Michael Thrasher, a reporter who has been in the wealth management space for more than a decade in various iterations. He recently started his own business, Modus, which is a weekly newsletter about family offices. He'll be sharing how he's made the leap throughout his career and built up the family office niche. Mike, thanks so much for being on the podcast. It's quite interesting to have you on because in the time that I've known you, I feel like your brand has been evolving. Thanks so much for doing this.
I'm so happy to do it and excited to talk about it.
So first question is what your favorite brand is and why?
This is so tough. My favorite brand, I don't know if I have a specific company, but I definitely have some brands that kind of stick out to me. Think of when I think of cool brands. I'm always impressed by brands that have made some changes, even to like their logo, but that haven't really. I'm sure if you worked at one of these companies, these people might argue that like they have changed pretty significantly over time. But at least like to me, a consumer, it has not changed terribly much. And I just am like kind of interested in that, like Diet Coke.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed like that much. Or like a lot of news brands, the Wall Street Journal and some others. These organizations have obviously changed and evolved in many ways, in some cases significantly. But I mean, when you go and you still find some of these like broadsheets at the bodega or whatever, it looks and it's still doing pretty much the same thing. So I don't have a specific, this is a totally unsatisfying answer maybe, but I'm always really interested in these brands that have this tremendous longevity, regardless of whatever, service or product or thing that they do.
Well, actually, it's interesting that that's the answer that you gave, because I would categorize that as what your brand is, that when we first met, you were more in the wealth management, like very broad space, but not necessarily family office. And then kind of, at least in my perspective, and I would love to hear yours, kind of niched into family office. So if I had to say who you are as a person or as a brand, you are the wealth management reporter. But I think, within that, like, you've become and defined yourself a little bit better. Would you say that that's a fair characterization or not?
Yeah, I think that's a good characterization. I mean, you're spot on that I have, for most of my journalism career, 10, 11, or almost 12 years, or whatever that's been, I've spent almost all that time reporting on some part of financial services, and most of that time has been some part of wealth and asset management. And this is like a sort of continued distillation or area of narrowing of focus to be reporting on family offices. And one of the things that by design or not that happens is that when you are more narrowly focused and there's fewer and fewer people doing that narrowly focused thing, you sort of become that much more intertwined with those sources and that corner of whatever industry or thing that you're doing as a journalist. This is certainly not unique to like financial services, but like anybody who's like covering politics broadly, who then ends up covering only the Senate, who then ends up only covering whatever. There's so many ways that throughout a journalism career, you can end up more focused or not. The more focused you are, like I said, like you sort of become synonymous with that beat and thing just because there's just not many other people doing it.
That's a very good point. So do you feel like your evolution into family office, was it sort of happenstance, or do you feel like it was some kind of like fate or design or some mix of all of those things? How do you feel like you went from, more broad wealth and asset management into family office?
I like to think it was very planned and a good strategic decision. And the reality, I think, is it was pretty serendipitous, I guess. I obviously knew of and a little bit about family offices and continued to sort of cross paths with some of those investors, or just I knew people that were leaving some asset managers or other companies and institutions and organizations to go work for a family office. So these were sort of people that I knew or knew a little bit about, but wasn't really doing much reporting or writing many articles about ever until about a year or so ago. And it was admittedly sort of just a nice combination of, I thought it was something that when I was working at Institutional Investor magazine at the time, it was something that I felt was relevant enough and interesting enough that I could write about. And it was sort of checking all the boxes it needed to for us as a magazine. and was coupling nicely with just my own interest as a journalist. And so that I wish I could say this was all some kind of scheme to get to this point. I've also done some other stuff outside of journalism and helped start either news websites or worked at a startup outside of journalism and stuff like that. And it's just not a path I could recommend someone try to replicate to get to this point. It's just sort of nicely worked out that way. And I think I'm very lucky that I've over really many years and various places I've worked with a lot of really great, smart people. And I've tried to collect as much pieces of these experiences. And then that coupled with what I was doing more recently and my interest in family offices kind of all mashed together into this idea that is Modus.
That's the perfect intro. If you could tell our listeners, if they're not familiar already, what you're doing with Modus and how it came about.
Modus is a weekly newsletter for family office professionals. For anybody listening that might not know what a family office even is or how many of these people there are or whatever. In short, a family office is this thing that either an individual or family, hence the name, creates, which is really just a collection of a small group of people who are working explicitly, doing all kinds of different things for only this family. So instead of like you or I might have an accountant that does our taxes for us and a financial advisor that manages our investments, and I might have a person that comes and mows our lawn when we can't get around to it or whatever. If you're somebody that has I mean, this is I think really the right adjective, like an extreme level of wealth, but still the number of hours and years to live as us. What they do is they decide, okay, I either want a higher level of service where it makes more sense. I might even be able to save some money if I hire some people to do these things only for me. And oftentimes it's not just about the convenience. They really do, in some cases, arguably require that because of their complexity or whatever. So that's why people hire these folks and end up with a family office of some form or kind in general. And so to answer your question more directly, why do journalism explicitly for these people that are hired for these offices? The short answer is there are just many more of them now. A family office was something that was definitely a little more esoteric, even 10, 15, 20 years ago, and certainly before then. Some of these things existed, but this was not a term that was part of many people's lexicon, even in financial services. Okay, so fast forward to today, there's at least 3,500 single family offices in North America alone. There's something like 7,000 or 8,000, depending on your sort of definition of an office, that number is actually there's actually probably more than that in the US and then also globally. And they employ something like an average of probably about 10 people, but it's probably a little fewer than that. But even if they're employing, say, like 5 people on average, times thousands of them that exist now, this is actually like a pretty big group of professionals, and they have a tremendous breadth of responsibilities. Many people think of the family offices, and many of them serve this function as really an investment office. These are people who are hired explicitly to focus only on this person's entire investment portfolio and figure out the best way to manage that according to, this person or family's mission or objectives. And many of them do that, but most of the employees actually are really focused on sort of everything X investment management, like all that stuff I mentioned earlier, some of their accounting and helping them manage their properties and their philanthropy and like all kinds of other stuff. When you think about all these people, in aggregate, it's a lot of professionals, but relative to the assets and influence that they have, it's really not a lot of people. So this collection of 8,000, give or take, single family offices globally, their assets in aggregate is something like 7 trillion roughly.
Wow.
And so when you think about the influence that these people have on the industries where they generated their wealth, a lot of them still have like an operating company. So they're still actively, they aren't just people that sold a business and have had this huge windfall. I mean, many of them, that is the case, but many of them are the busiest, most active professionals there are. So when you think about the influence they have on their own industries, on philanthropy, on financial services, on politics, if that's something they're involved in or whatever, it's kind of wild when you think about there being, I don't know, only in the tens of thousands of employees on the low side that are helping sort of make all this happen.
Yeah.
And I just felt like what I think is a good characterization is them being journalistically underserved. I just had like alarms going off in my head as a reporter. It's just a crazy group of professionals to feel like there isn't journalism really explicitly for them. And so, and that was, it was really exciting because I was already interested in this group. And I also had quite a bit of experience writing about private wealth management and asset management and so many of the things that are very much a part of these offices. And that was a good launch pad with the enthusiasm of my personal interest in this group as investors, sort of dive into this and make something for them.
As far as defining the journalism for them, because I can kind of see your point that absent something like you have to look at accounting news, you have to look at asset management news, you have to look at wealth management. It's so disparate that I could understand the utility of having something that's really just tailored for you. But how did you come about deciding what the coverage is of Modus and building that from the ground up?
Yeah, you're totally right. There's just so many things that to try and find the publication for these individual responsibilities and keep up with that. I mean, there's no shortage of publications writing about investment management and markets and all kinds of things, right? That's just like one of the things that they do. So you're exactly right. One of the reasons I started Modus is for it to be a distillation and to do some original reporting that, as best as I can, am highlighting like some of the most timely, relevant, and really like actionable things for these folks across the breadth of that. And I really felt like that's already very challenging. And I just felt like there was almost no way I was going to be able to do it. You're not going to be successful if this is a hobby. I really felt like how I envisioned it not just could, but like should be done, and for it to be done the best way. Modus had to be focused only on that. And for Modus to be successful and do that, it could not ignore any sort of part of that. So Modus, it would never be successful if it was just about their investment because of all those other professionals I described. So I'll write about and have written about their portfolios and their decision making, but I've also written about their service providers and the software that they use and sort of very ineloquently how the sausage gets made. And then also I think Modus hasn't done a ton of this, but I think hopefully will in the near future and certainly beyond. Professionals and everybody ultimately wants to read about the people, the actual decision makers, and better understand why people are doing the things that they're doing. And this is something that is oftentimes absent, if for no other reason. And this isn't to say that like other news organizations aren't doing this well, but they're only focused on like the largest news organizations are really focused on a pretty short list of the wealthiest people who have family offices. They're not really focused on the offices and a lot of these same things. There's just so many people in offices and interesting things that their peers I know are interested in. So it would be silly for Modus to like just pick one of these things and because they're so inseparable from one another.
You perfectly answered my question. Thank you. Getting to that point, I feel like you're sort of part of a trend that I've seen recently is that reporters are going from large institutional places and then just saying, you know what, whether it's because of layoffs, not liking the kind of journalism that's there, knowing that they can do better, any of those, all of those above, they're going off and they're branching into doing their own things. And it's interesting. It seems like we're at this tipping point where, from a PR perspective, obviously people want the cover of the New York Times and the cover of the Wall Street Journal. But now it's almost like you should want the top feature in Modus because I know that you're going to devote like the time and attention to an article. So it's interesting seeing that shift and you being a part of it. How do you feel like it's been, or what sort of tipped you to say, you know, I'm not going to try to like work from within. I'm going to just do it myself.
Yeah, it was a culmination of things. So you're right. This has been going on for a little while now, and it's not slowing down. I don't know how much it's accelerating or not. I don't think there's like a lot of concrete data about this or anything. If there is, I'd love to see that if it's out there. Yeah, but you're totally right. A lot of journalists who are good enough at their job and have enough of a sort of personal notoriety with the professionals that they're oftentimes writing for, but it could be anybody. And I think have the desire to really not just do journalism, but to also be entrepreneurial. That group is growing. And why someone's actually like leaving a big organization depends on who you ask. I always say this though, like things like Modus are always going to be supplemental to the New York Times and the Journal and Bloomberg and a lot of other places. I don't really view them as competitors. Like I said, I think things like Modus are supplemental. It might be sort of broadening the depth of things relevant to specific people and going to a depth that, not to say that some of the bigger organizations aren't doing, but they're not doing it every week or every quarter. It might even be more sporadic than that. That's really the sort of gap that things like Modus fill. So if you're somebody working in a big organization and you see that opportunity and you already know that journalistically you could do it, there's enough of those people that you could build a business out of it, at least a very small one or one to pay yourself. And you also really do have the interest in that. Like, are you ready to like dive into QuickBooks? Are you ready to, I mean, you know, this also being a small business owner does not mean just doing the actual thing that you're doing. It also means running a business. And in some ways, like small ones are actually like a bigger pain in the ass because you have to do so much of it yourself. So I'm not someone that ever actually in my career thought I would be starting a company or doing something, but I checked enough of those boxes that I felt like it was worth giving it a shot.
And I'm glad that you did, because from like a personal fulfillment standpoint, that's always important. And B, I think from the coverage standpoint, having been in some of those newsrooms, because the mandate is so much on like keep going, keep going, keep going, and you have to feed the beast. There's less of the like let's like give this its time and let it breathe, and maybe this is a trend that's going to take several months to develop. So I appreciate what you're doing, and I think that it's really helpful to the family office community. What's the feedback been like so far?
The feedback has been great. Nobody notices exactly what you described more than the readers. The largest organizations are sort of their own category. I mean, they're just so different and so important. And there's like what those places are actually doing and how they're operating and why. And then I think the closer real sort of competitors, I guess, and what you were describing, so many small media companies and publications, they're facing many of the same headwinds as the biggest organizations. Like if you do journalism, the headwind that literally every person faces, which is the percent of ad dollars spent,
right,
going increase, that percentage is only expanding. More of those dollars are being spent, even though the total dollars spent is growing and continues to grow. A greater percentage of those dollars are going toward, frankly, just more effective marketing for some companies. So you can't really be mad at the companies for spending their ad dollars on social media and search and all kinds of other things if they feel like they're getting better results. I try not to spend many minutes ever like thinking about that. What I think about is, what can I do that's valuable, that's going to still draw attention and be different and create an audience that I can still build a business with. The problem, like you said, a lot of reporters run into is, in addition to that headwind, a lot of organizations lack ownership, type of investment capital, and then a sort of operations alignment. If one of those things, or especially if more than one of those things is sort of broken, then you end up kind of running your business, a news business, in a perverse way, which is we send X number of newsletters per week and something has to go in that newsletter.
Right.
And it totally changes how you think as a journalist. It completely changes how you think as a journalist. This was one of the reasons that I started Modus. Is I very decidedly owned the company entirely and bootstrapped it. I could very easily probably decide to send 2 newsletters a week instead of just a weekly newsletter and fill it with something. And in theory, that sounds really great because I've doubled my ad real estate I could sell. Right. But what impact is that going to have on the actual quality of it? And that's ultimately what readers recognize is better quality. Everybody's playing this balancing act, which is we have to feed the beast and you have to do something. But you have to do this with a quality of journalism in mind, and then be thoughtful and really let that dictate the frequency and what it is that you're doing. And the medium, there's a lot of things that are easy about the newsletter, but like, who knows, in the future, maybe the best way to reach this audience is actually also in the form of a podcast. Maybe it is actually something that looks closer to like a typical news website that's publishing articles on something every day. Right now, the newsletter is the thing and the business. Yes, but maybe in the future, it's other things. I think it could and probably will be, but I don't know. There's some of my thoughts about what differentiates Modus versus some other smaller publications, and that sort of rat race that people feel like they're on versus I don't feel any less busy, but I like to think that I like to think that what I'm doing is hopefully like a little bit better, like in a minimum
Yes.
worthwhile or interesting.
You're already getting that kind of feedback. It's already been very well received, and you haven't even really been out that long. So that's fabulous to see.
Yeah, totally. I feel very lucky. I tend to err on the side of being overly optimistic about all things. I think it's going, for 4 months, give or take. I've been
Mm.
sending the newsletter. I think it's going better than I probably realistically could have hoped so far. So
Uh,
knock on wood, knock on something. I don't know. Ask me again in like 3 weeks.
May it continue that way. So, is there anything that you want to share with our listeners about the future of Modus, or why they ought to be signing up for this newsletter if it applies to them? Obviously, it doesn't apply to everybody.
One thing I don't really articulate on the website, but is increasingly apparent is, I guess, like so many things, there's quite a lot of gray area. So Modus is explicitly for, and I'm always writing first and foremost for the single family offices,
Okay.
but there's a huge universe of people who find value in what I'm doing and are interested in it for a variety of reasons, including a lot of people that are more typical private wealth managers and people at firms, because even though they aren't working for a single family office, they might have a client who is exceptionally wealthy. If you have a client who doesn't have a single family office, but they're still worth like 60, 80, or maybe even like $100 million or more. I know that sounds kind of wild. In family office world, all the numbers sound a little absurd, and you become sort of numb to it. Or I have.
Yeah.
That person doesn't have a single family office, but they might require, at least in sort of piecemeal, certain services or things or attention or all the above. So there's a few hundred or better people who are not employed by single family offices, but work for a multifamily office, whether
Right.
it's like a true, like, two families hiring one accountant or one person to work for both of them instead of both of them hiring an accountant. They
Yeah.
sort of have combined resources all the way up to the huge commercial organizations that are marketing themselves as multifamily offices and are increasingly trying to figure out, okay, how do we work with the single family offices on some level? So it's kind of, that's like kind of a tough thing to communicate. So every opportunity I get, I'm kind of like banging that drum that, if you're somebody that's working for and with ultra high net worth individuals, even if they don't have a single family office, there's probably stuff in Modus that's worthwhile and interesting. The other thing I've also been doing more than I thought is talking to journalists and other people about many of the things that like we talked about. I've gotten a lot of emails, not a ton, but more than I thought about, from other journalists that focus on and report on all kinds of different things, asking me, how much money did I save? Why did you choose this platform versus another? And how difficult is it to sell ads? And do you actually think like my idea is a good one? And I've tried as best as I can to like spend time with some of those people and for whatever it's worth, give my opinion or try to help them at least like figure out how to answer. I'm not gonna be able to answer a lot of those questions for them, but at least like help them think about it, because it's much easier if you write about financial services. There's still a huge pool of people that are willing to spend a shiny penny to get in front of, especially like the wealthiest investors and other decision makers for that on their behalf.
Yeah.
And so first, I feel so lucky that it has worked out very nicely, that I just happen to be focused on that group and doing that already. Other people, the decision might be much more difficult to leave a big organization or a small one. If you're doing the napkin math for ad dollars or what you charge for a subscription, and then suddenly you're realizing, I'm not going to replace my salary, I'm going to make half as much as I was, is it still worth it? So that's the other thing I'm not terribly experienced, obviously, having just like sort of done this once with Modus, but as much time as I can make for helping people do that, I've been trying to.
It's great that you do that. So similarly, being a relatively new business owner, as much as you can prepare beforehand or research or whatever, you have no idea what you're doing until you actually get in there, and it's, oof, gosh, this was much more than what I thought it was going to be. So finding that tribe and those people that'll encourage you and offer advice and whatnot is invaluable. So thank you for doing that.
I'm just trying to like pay it forward. I'm sure it sounds like you experience this too. I've been like actually overwhelmed with the number of people that have sent me a note, just letting me know any way that they can help. People from journalism and all kinds of people across industries that I just have like some connection with that have at some point decided, oh, I'm going to do this thing on my own or start something. I very humbly have said, let me help you avoid some of the things and the mistakes that I made. And yeah, I'm just trying to pay that forward, put out good vibes into the world, into the universe.
So as a final question, and I feel like it's a great one to leave off on because it says a lot about you as a person, and I'm reducing that to a brand just because of the name of the podcast. But the fact that you're getting this outpouring means that, you know, you're a good person and that's being reflected back at you. What would you encourage people to do to build their own brands up, or companies for that matter?
I think that especially because of social media, people really celebrate and have this expectation about the sort of instant gratification of a post going viral and all this stuff. And there's something obviously to that, but ultimately it's amazing like how fleeting those things are. And this is something that I already knew, but I still didn't really appreciate until I started Modus. You go on a podcast or you write a newsletter that's that you think is especially great, and then people are emailing you about it or whatever, and then you sort of see like the 50 people that sign up as a result. There's sort of like this extra bump, but that's like literally one day.
Yes.
And so you really realize that this is not just about like gaming some system to get attention. This is really about putting as organized and as thoughtful as possible effort in every day. And the same, I think, can be said and is actually more important about relationships with actual people. All of those people that I mentioned that have reached out, these are not people that I met necessarily. These are people that I have only recently come in contact with, like in the last 4 months. But most of them are actually people that have sort of like come out of my like professional history. So I encourage people, if you don't decide you have a personal brand, it's this thing that takes many years, and you should always do as best as you can and treat people with respect, and on an incremental basis, day over day. Those things is sort of hard to quantify. It doesn't feel like that might be making a difference, but spending a little extra time with people and really trying to do a good job at anything that you're doing, it does accumulate. If you do that every day over years as a journalist with sources and other people, then 10 years later you sort of step back and you're like, oh shit, actually,
right?
I do know like a lot of people, and I have done my best to be a good professional and try to be a good person. That good intendedness is paying off now. I guess in short, trying to be your best and engage with people every day, it does have an amazing like cumulative effect later on. And so that's what people should try to do. One other thing I would add is some people really like being the brand. You know, to some degree, if you start something, you are synonymous with the brand.
Yep.
And this is a good and a bad thing. And you have to figure out how you're going to navigate that at every phase of anything that you do, regardless of the type of business. But I think especially in journalism, there's so many people that sort of associate, and I think still to this degree associate me as someone who was like a reporter at Institutional Investor.
Yes.
And there's tons of people that did not even know I worked at Institutional Investor, but just now know me as this guy that writes this newsletter for family office professionals. And so at some point though, as Modus grows, which is my ambition, it will not just be me. The website URL is modus.news, not thrasher.news for a reason. If you really like being like the brand, then you can make a business and do that. But if your goal is to grow a company and do other things, then you got to be able to let go of that too.
Yes. People make strategic or maybe even not strategic decisions thinking I should name the brand after myself, but then obviously it's a little harder to back away from it, or God forbid when you pass, what happens to it? So it's an interesting decision that people have to make or do make and then have to live with the consequences of. So it's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a great point. What do people say about like culture at companies? Like this is a thing that is ever evolving. No matter how little time you spend on, like the culture of your business, there is a culture developing, and this is happening. And that's why you have to spend at least like a little bit of time thinking about that and like putting that in some kind of box or that's actually a terrible way to think about it. Actually, I like to think of it more as like a garden that you're manicuring. It's like you're letting it grow and do things, and you're sort of methodically thinking about what that cannon should look like. Yeah. And to not think about those things as a brand, regardless of how synonymous with that brand you are or aren't, you have to acknowledge that is changing, right? And if you want it to change and you want it to be a certain way, then you have to invest like time and energy in thinking about that. And maybe that literally starts with like the first day, which is, why would I call this Modus instead of like the Thrasher newsletter? I feel like some of the answers are kind of obvious, but like some of them might not. There's like questions about that and how you do that. It's not totally clear.
Although, so I appreciate the naming of this, but you have to admit that as somebody who has a relatively cool last name, it could work out for you as opposed to the rest of us who have meh last names. But anyway.
Yeah. I have to admit, it's a last name that is memorable, probably underwhelming to some given my personal stature, but like, but it has its perks, like no bartender has like ever forgot my tab or anything like that.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
You're so welcome. Happy to be on and talk about this kind of stuff. It's always it's fun being the interviewee, someone on the other side of the tape.
Yeah, I know, right? It's a busman's holiday for you.